Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and I'm delighted that in Barry Manilow's musical Copacabana we learned that her name was Lola and she was a showgirl, but he called her Rover. Woof woof. Well, enough of that nonsense, and on to something a bit more serious. I find it almost impossible to believe that time travels as fast as it does. And to give you a very good idea of this, when I was a little boy, one of the big musicals that was on in London was Jesus Christ Superstar. And it's one of those evergreens that's been around ever since. But that first production opened in 1972, which is 50 years ago. And so it's celebrating its Golden Jubilee this year, at least in terms of its appearance on the London stage. It had actually opened on Broadway in 1971, and before that, of course, had been a concept album released in 1970. But it was that 1972 London production that was the big success and which absolutely sealed it as one of the great musical shows of the last 5 decades, which it undoubtedly is. The 1971 Broadway production didn't do nearly so well, whereas in London it ran from 1972 continuously to 1980 and, at the time, became the longest-running London musical. That's a record that's been broken a few times since, but 8 years is 8 years and not to be sniffed at. And in one of those very strange facts which almost seem impossible to believe, apparently the famous composer Shostakovich came to see the show with his son in that London production. That seems a very strange meshing of two very different cultures, but stranger things have happened. So what is it about Jesus Christ Superstar that has made it such a successful perennial show? One answer might be that it's actually a show that you can continue to reinvent to match the particular zeitgeist of the period in which you're putting on a new production. That's a fairly clumsy sentence in saying that it moves with the times, or at least it can do. But there may be many other reasons. And actually, I rather hope that in this week's episode of Musical Talk and next week, we'll be able to investigate that question in detail, because the very excellent composer and friend of this programme, Tom Arnold, sat down with me last year to talk about having seen a large number of different versions of Jesus Christ Superstar, which not only had been very satisfactory to him, but also allowed him to see lots of little differences and to analyse the text, if you like, the narrative of the piece, and indeed all the aspects of the production from lots of different possible ways. Now, Tom is no mean mind, and I was very interested to hear what he had to say about all these comparable productions of Jesus Christ Superstar. So he and I had a conversation all about that very thing. And I hope you get as much out of listening to this conversation over the next 2 weeks as I had listening to what Tom had to say about it when we recorded it. Here he is, the very excellent Tom Arnold, and his views on Jesus Christ's Superstars. Musical Talk. Hello, Tom. How are you?
Hi, Thos. I'm doing all right, all things considered. How are you doing?
Yeah, I think I'm doing okay as well. Thank you for asking. Lovely to talk to you. Every conversation with you yields interesting facts and opinions for me, and I know today's going to be no different, but we do have a very particular show that we're coming from very different angles. It's a show that you know inside out and have experienced through lots of different recordings and versions and performances. And a show that I've been aware of all my life, but I only saw for the very first time on the night before we recorded this conversation. And that is Jesus Christ Superstar. Now, bearing in mind that this is something that you're living and breathing at the moment, do you want to tell us a little bit about it in general terms?
Yeah, sure. So, Jesus Christ Superstar is the retelling of the Easter story that Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice wrote together famously one of their very first works together. So Joseph was at a similar time and sort of developing alongside. Was hugely famous as a concept album and also controversial on release for a few reasons. What I find so interesting about it is, unlike a lot of the Weber and Rice shows that have survived sort of as long-running productions or big lavish productions, Jesus Christ Superstar is one that kind of keeps coming back in radically different forms every time. I saw the brilliant Regent's Park open air production last summer as we were coming out of lockdown that kind of opened up, and it was off the back of that I became really interested in watching different versions and listening to different versions. But I'm really interested to hear, as somebody coming to it quite fresh and quite new, what your take on the show was.
Well, oh gosh, thank you for that. Well, let me tell you what I know, or what I knew about it, and what I didn't warm to about it before I got to see it.
Yeah.
Because, as I say, it's been around all my life in real terms. It was a concept album in 1970. And I believe the first proper production sort of rolled up a couple of years after that as a stage production. And that's well before my memory starts. So the first thing I became aware of in relation to Jesus Christ Superstar was the famous playground chant. I don't know if it was still in currency when you were a boy, but it was Jesus Christ Superstar, came down to earth on a Yamaha, did a skid, killed a kid, and then did something inappropriate with a dustbin lid, I'm sorry to say. It's the kind of doggerel that you get in a classroom or a playground. This is primary school, so I would have been a junior or an infant even. So I think it was junior. I was probably about 7. So it was sufficiently well known by children.
Yes.
And the reason I suspect it was sufficiently well known by children is because it was an enormous hit. And of course, it was also leapt on by the easy listening brigade. I don't use that term in any kind of sense pejoratively. Like a lot of those scores from that period, including things like Hair, the melodies are very strong and were very quickly lapped up by sort of easy listening big band orchestras, and therefore played on, the rock version might be played on Radio 1, but the easy listening strings version might be played on BBC Radio 2.
Yeah.
And so it became, like a lot of Lloyd Webber stuff at that period, quite ubiquitous. So I was aware of it from those odd sort of transformations, if you like. My family would have been a much more Radio 2 family than a Radio 1 family, so I probably would never have heard any of the original songs in their original recordings, in the rock versions, but I would have heard a lot of Everything's All Right and that kind of, the more easy listening songs from the show, then once again removed into more easy listening versions once again.
Yeah.
But also, there was something about the show title which didn't really appeal to me. I suspect it's a little bit gimmicky. And as a child, I was quite small C conservative. So, to me, if someone told me there was a new musical coming to Edinburgh called Jesus Christ Superstar, I would just put it in that bucket of shows called something ! The musical.
Yes.
That we all know so well. I mean, for example, we're recording this in 2021. I know, and you know, that in 2022, the Edinburgh Festival Fringe will be full of COVID! The musical.
Oh, God, yes.
Or lockdown! The musical. You know it and I know it. And we all know it. So, in its way, it's one of those shows that, certainly in a small C conservative environment, would have seemed a little bit gimmicky and might have seemed a little bit radical.
Yeah.
And certainly my family were not radical in any sense. There was a place for religion and it was what it was, but you didn't review it or shine a contemporary light on it.
Interesting.
So for whatever reason, my family upbringing probably moved me in a particular way that a show with the title Jesus Christ Superstar was not going to excite me. In the same way that Joseph, funnily enough, I was never interested in the retelling of religious stories. I've subsequently caught up on that, but at the time, it was just not the kind of thing I was going to do. But you have to remember, I was a very strange child. I was about to fall in love with Gilbert and Sullivan. So it may be that the rock operas of Andrew Lloyd Webber were not going to be my first love.
It's an interesting point you make about the title, because certainly coming to it now, I was tangentially involved with. I played rehearsal piano for an Amdram production of Jesus Christ Superstar.
Oh, did you?
A couple of years back. And I remember talking to them about trying to promote it, and they were struggling with the fact that it's, with that title, and when you're handing out the flyers for Jesus Christ Superstar, it looks like a religious sort of festival type thing in the kind of new evangelical kind of frame.
Yes, doesn't it?
Which is one of the most interesting bits of the show, because of course it is telling that story, but there are so many different ways you can interpret this show and its view on religion that I find really interesting to unpack.
Well, I'm so glad you said that, because I suspect that's going to be where our next little bit of conversation, which is sort of my interpretation of seeing it for the first time, will sit. But it's really, I'm very interested to hear about that evangelical side to it, because you're right. I mean, first of all, for better or for worse, certainly in Britain, the perception of the evangelical Christian movement is that it's about 30 years behind the time. You know, the joke is, isn't it, that it's someone with a guitar in a slightly hippie-ish way, wanting you to clap along with slightly more easy listening versions of not hymns but songs in a religious vein. Whether that's true is, that's open for interpretation, and I'm not here to judge that, but that is how it's perceived. And you're right. And the thing about Jesus Christ Superstar is, I believe that at least some elements of the evangelical movement have adopted some of its songs.
Really? Interesting.
I believe so. There are a few songs there which you can absolutely take out of their context, as it were, and are very... when I say laudable, I do mean it in the religious sense. L-A-U-D, not L-O-R-D, obviously, but, they are sort of praising songs.
Yeah.
So, yes, I mean, funnily enough, listening to it, there were some things that just leapt out at me, and I thought, oh, well, that could easily sit in the evangelical Christian songbook. So I sat down, knowing we were going to have this conversation. I thought, well, it's about time in my long and venerable life that I actually sat down and made myself watch a show which I've never thought very much, not of, that's wrong, about. I just, because I ruled it out as a child, I've never really revisited it. It's just one of those shows I thought, oh, there it is. It's a successful show, but it's not one that interests me. And I must be honest, it still isn't a show that interests me. But of course, like any decent work of art, and that is what it is, it does have something to say, and therefore I have something to say about what it has to say. And so my reaction was, I sat down last night and I watched the online version of the 2012 arena tour version, if you like. So it's only 90 minutes, I think, all in all. It's quite chopped down, no interval, and it is staged and fully performed, but it's staged in a way that you can have to stage it in an arena rather than in a theatre. Yeah. So you have to have a very versatile one set.
Yes.
So it's principally a backdrop and a set of stairs. And so that's what I was getting. But, you've got to start somewhere. So I thought, okay. So I sat down. Now, overall, I was much more impressed with it than I thought I was going to be. And I was sufficiently engaged by the story or by some of the decisions made in the storytelling. But I think before we go any further, if you're happy to hear my particular take on it first, because I really want to then compare it with your much more nuanced and broad reading of my one... Well, mine's a one-take hit, You are the expert in the virtual room.
That's a lot of pressure.
Oh, yeah, I'm setting you right up there. But before we go any further, I think it's really important to say that when we are discussing the narrative, the book, the dramaturgy, if you like, of Jesus Christ Superstar, we are confining it to what we are being presented with. So this episode of Musical Talk is not meant to be a discussion on theology. I hope no one will take anything we say as any kind of comment on the actual stories in the Gospels, in the Bible. We're not here to counter or question anyone's beliefs. But of course, we come to it from our own personal views. And so we have to contextualise it in our own understanding of where we are, but also, much more importantly, focusing it on how it is written. And that was the thing that really struck me. So let me dispose of the music quickly. It's a rock score for the most part, although there's a hell of a lot of easy listening stuck in there.
Yes.
So there was enough there to keep me entertained. I mean, I've always... The one song that's escaped from the show that I like is Everything's All Right. Partly because I like the melody, partly I like the smoothness and the calming nature of the song, which of course is how it's written. And also it has that really interesting, I think, time signature, which I'm sure you as an expert are going to be able to tell me about, and which I merely sit there going, oh, something quirky's happening here. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I like it.
Yes, it's sat on a sort of 5/4. So it's 5 beats in a bar, and it's very similar to the groove in, like, the most famous example of that, I guess, is Take 5 by Dave Brubeck. That da 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 da. It's sitting on that same groove throughout. But yeah,
that's interesting. Yes, and I've always liked Dave Brubeck's Take 5. There's another song, isn't there? Love is a word for the blues, which is a song from the 50s and 60s. It's very rare. People don't really know it, but it's got that same kind of... I believe it claims to be the first song in 5/4 time with lyrics. Now, whether it was or not, I wouldn't like to say. But if you ever get a copy of it or can hear it, do, because I like that song a great deal as well. I find that There's something tricksy about this time signature. And of course, if it has lyrics, it's actually very, very difficult to sing.
Yes.
There's no breathing point. But Everything's All Right is much more deceptive than that. You can tell something strange is happening with the time signature, but of course it's slow. But it's a great song. And so I knew, and that comes on very early. So I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. That set me calm. And whilst rock is never going to be my first idiom of choice, actually, Lloyd Webber has a very great talent when it comes to writing melodic rock, because not all rock is melodic. And so there's a melody there if you listen out for it, and that's what I grip onto.
Yeah.
So musically, I found the score, for the most part, I mean, it's obviously been zizzed up for the 21st century in terms of arrangements, although its 70s forebears were still coming through. It was an interesting fusion meal. So I quite like the score. The lyrics, obviously, that's how I navigate a piece. It's through the words and the lyrics. It's sung through, so you are relying entirely on what you're hearing through the lyrics. And they're fine. So there's no problem with the lyrics. But the reason I've got that slight tone in my voice is because actually I think narratively it's a little bit awkward. Also, the characterizations are a bit strange. So the two things, you asked me what I thought of it, and I've already given you a very long answer, but forgive me, the two things I'd really like to discuss with you from my point of view would be the narrative nature of the point-to-point of the story and the characterization. So let's do the narrative first. Now, it expects you to have a thumbnail understanding of as you say, the Easter stories, or the last week or two of Jesus' life.
Yes.
It's building up to the crucifixion. Sorry, that's a spoiler.
Spoiler for the Easter story.
Yeah, quite. I mean, 2,000 years in the making.
Sorry if anybody's reading the Bible at the moment. Spoiled some of the last few chapters there.
I think we're all waiting for the Netflix series. So, but seriously, I found it quite interesting because I thought, this doesn't seem to quite cohere. It's very episodic. Now, is that because it's a song after a song after a song with no linking dialogue? But that shouldn't be the problem, because there's lots of sung-through shows and musicals and operetta. Or, as I subsequently realised, is it because it's really still showing its structural roots as an album? It was written as an album first.
Yeah.
Or rather, it wasn't envisaged, I believe. You may know better than I. I mean, it was obviously envisaged as a show, but they couldn't get backing for a show, Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, so they produced it as a concept album, and then from the concept album's success came the show. But of course, a concept album is just a series of songs. And it also, when one listens to the recorded score of any musical, as we've all done for years, all of us who are interested in musical theatre have a much broader understanding of musical theatre than the shows we've seen, because we've heard a lot of shows from the soundtrack recordings. They're not soundtracks, I know. The score recordings. I don't want to get letters. And they very rarely have dialogue. So actually we're really used to picking up stories or understanding a musical through its songs only. But on stage, I think we expect some more. And of course, you don't really get more. So I found the story a little bit bitty, a little bit point to point, a little bit episodic, and not always flowing very smoothly. Which I put down to a sort of the legacy of its original structure, and the fact that you're expected to know the story before you go in, and therefore they don't actually have to work on the narrative in that sense.
Yeah.
Of course, the other thing about it is I was watching a 90-minute version. I don't know how long it would normally be on stage, but this was a concert version. It was over in a trice in a way, very pacey. It had been picked, it didn't hang around. So it was a very effective show, I thought. But narratively, it didn't quite cohere. And it's only because I know the context of the story, i.e. the story before speech marks went in, that I was able to piece together what was going on. I wonder if you didn't come from the Christian tradition, shall we say, and that the Jesus story wasn't particularly well known to you, or known to you at all, whether you'd be able to work out what was going on.
It's certainly a complaint I've heard from other people about it, and talking to people that I've seen it with before have said that sometimes is a problem for them. Narratively, it's interesting what you say about it first developing from a concept album, because to me that's one of the most interesting bits of it, and as a result the most difficult thing to translate to stage is making it theatrical. Famously, the original Broadway run of it was panned by critics, and Webber and Rice themselves I don't think were huge fans of that production. It was very unusual because it was struggling with how do we get this, as you say, quite episodically told story onto stage.
Yeah.
And the more successful productions of it I've seen are the ones that take the least literal approach to making it look like a sort of traditional West End or Broadway show.
Oh.
So it's interesting you identify the steps as the backdrop. That's something that sort of has, for a while, become a fixture of a lot of different versions of the show. The Regent's Park production last year took a particularly almost impressionistic approach to it because they had to socially distance all the cast throughout the show.
Of course. As in Jesus Christ, there you are.
Exactly. But there's so they had steps that took up the whole breadth of the stage and were 2 meters deep each. So throughout the show, people would be moving on the steps, and they knew that if they were on this step and somebody else was on that one, they were far enough away. And so that kind of rake to the stage for quite a while has been part of it, and to also get the sense, I guess, of ascension at the end.
Well, yes. Do you know, but I thought that was, forgive me, I'm leaping in here. There's quite a lot of usage for stairs in that sense. It's not just because it offers you choreography, because it means you can see everyone when they're dancing because they're all on different steps. But actually, and I don't want to overplay this, but there is a sense that you can use steps to represent social hierarchy within the society that we're seeing. You know, Pontius Pilate, who is the Roman, comes in from the top when he's talking about his dream.
Yes.
He comes in from the top when he's coming in to interrogate Jesus, because in the social hierarchy, he is in the top.
Yes.
We open, in the concert version I saw, with Judas at the bottom. Not least because, I mean, obviously history has dealt Judas a bit of a reputational hand.
Yes.
So, so he's not remembered well. So he's at the bottom. But also, it's very quickly established that he's sort of falling out of favour in Jesus' circles. So within that smaller context, he's at the bottom, and then Jesus comes down from the top and walks down. And as you say, when Jesus is being, first of all, interrogated by Pilate, he's at the front of the stage, therefore at the bottom of the steps, therefore it's the lowest point of his life. And indeed, there's a song that says that. I don't know if you noticed, there's a clever, I'm sure you will have, by the way, there's a very clever inversion of Everything's All Right into a kind of sort of a negative song, using very similar melody and structure, just much more dark, when he's being interrogated.
Yes.
It inverts it. And then, of course, as you say, he climbs the steps for his crucifixion, which is obviously a personal tragedy for him as an individual. It marks the beginning of what might be termed the Christian movement.
Yes.
His crucifixion is the end of the Jesus story in a real sense. I know there's a little bit more, the resurrection, etc., etc. But, you know, it is that crucifixion. It is that point that creates the church, and off we go for the next 2,000 years. So, and that is why that's up. So, I mean, I know it doesn't work always, because Judas climbs up to reach the tree from which he hangs himself. And that's a necessity, because that's actually a projection.
Yeah.
But also, and it's also an odd parallel. I mean, he dies before Jesus. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? So, it's almost a macabre mirroring. So the step thing doesn't always work, but it is used very effectively, I think, to show who's up and who's down in, what we might call newspaper social terms, who's in and who's out.
Exactly, yeah. It's interesting you pick up on that kind of staging for a concert arena tour type version of it. Weirdly, that arena tour is one of the more literal productions of it that I've seen.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it's certainly... There's a lot of blocking in it and that kind of thing, which is portraying scenes very literally. The other thing it does is it's... Obviously, at the time it came out, 2012, we were coming out of the economic crisis in 2008. Occupy Wall Street movement was kind of a thing. And it very deliberately employs lots of symbolism and iconography of that movement. When we first see them, they're all anoraks and tents and that kind of thing, isn't it? It's very reminiscent.
And also the 2011 riots. Sorry, I interrupted you there.
Course,
but yes, because I, when I was reading, I was taking the London riots of 2011 as the basis. But you're quite right. There was also the climate change stuff. I'd forgotten that. So you're right. But it's both of those share very similar, as you say, iconography. Yeah. So thank you. I spoke over you there, Tom. I apologise, but you're quite right. It was very much of its time.
Yeah, absolutely. So and that's another interesting trend in how Jesus Christ Superstar has developed over the years. When looking back at, say, the original film of it,
73, is it? Something like that, the original film?
Around then. It's obviously sort of the hippie movement was earlier, but there are quite a few elements of that iconography put into that film.
The legacy of hair hangs heavily, I think.
Exactly, yes. So it's interesting seeing how real protest movements have influenced it and how it has used those to keep relevant in a way. And then comparing that to the Open Air Regent's Park production last year, obviously there have been huge social changes in the world that have been very obvious through the news over the last 4 years or so, and certainly last year, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, very prevalent protests in the news. And what I found really interesting about the Regent's Park production was how deliberately it didn't use any real world parallels.
Did it not? That's interesting.
Yeah, I think it almost felt like those issues had been, and this is very much my reading of it, it almost felt like those issues had become so obvious that to put them in the show would feel like it was beating you over the head. Like, I feel like there's a very obvious production of Jesus Christ Superstar that could be made where Herod is Trump.
Of course, yes.
And that kind of thing. And it's almost the point you don't need to make those obvious comparisons because they're there for the audience to draw them, if that makes sense.
Also, if because the 2012 tour, I believe, was massively successful.
Yeah, it was huge.
And of course, it's been recorded and is available because I've watched it. So that has a huge currency, and of course, because it uses the iconography, which is so immediately understandable, even from 2021 back to 2012. Then presumably to do a production in 2019, you don't want to be seen to be retreading the last big, well-remembered production. So you've got to take it in a different direction as well. I assume there must be an artistic choice, which is not just about not being obvious, as you say, about the even more obvious iconography you could use now, but the need to not just be rehashing the same concept.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting because I love the fact that you can play it both ways. I mean, it's...
For me,
but it takes us back to whether it should be literal or not. Sorry, carry on.
For me, that's one of the ongoing interesting approaches that directors take to this show as well, is that it reminds me a lot, not necessarily in the writing, it reminds me of Shakespeare, but it reminds me of the way people approach Shakespeare productions now. It's very rare, really, unless you go to, say, the Globe, to see a Shakespeare production that's in traditional dress and that kind of thing. It's normally in an ultra-modernised version or a sort of hybrid modern fantasy version. And Jesus Christ Superstar has gone the same way. Like, it's never performed in togas and sandals. No. It's always this strange hybrid of whatever's current, and often set against the backdrop, though. The 2012 production that you watch doesn't do this, but other productions often do. The backgrounds will be ruins that are reminiscent of historical structures in the Middle East, but in the foreground there'll be a modern dress and that kind of thing. Oh,
I see. Because no, you're right. But the flip side is that the one I saw, it was Birmingham Central Library, I believe. So, which is a brutalist structure. I took that. There's a very strange moment when a Soviet building representing the the Roman rule came in. It doesn't pull its punches on the Roman overlords, because they do talk about being occupied right at the beginning. Actually, it does set that up quite interestingly. And of course, that's often a little fact that's sort of lost in the general retelling, certainly at primary school, of Jesus' story. But actually, the nation was currently under occupation. But
yeah,
which does put an interesting, to be reminded of that so early on in the story, also helps explain why there is this, let's be honest, very successful kind of sort of counter-revolutionary, if you want to term it in that way, movement under Jesus, or at least he's being promoted as a kind of Messiah character, which, well, I suppose, it goes with the territory, doesn't it? But you know what I mean. But people are always on the lookout for a Messiah. We've seen it in British politics for the last few years on one side of the political divide. Well, actually, on both sides, actually, in a very strange way. Although I don't want to press that allegory too far. But okay, that's really interesting. And and in a minute, I hope to explore more with you about what might be called the variations. But that, to me, is usually the sign of a classic. I mean, it's interesting you said Shakespeare, but funnily enough, my brain immediately returned to Gilbert and Sullivan.
Okay.
As it so often does. But these days, you'd have to go a long way to find what might be called a traditional d'oyly carte style production. It used to have the reputation, Gilbert and Sullivan, of always being performed in exactly the same way, more or less, as Gilbert himself had directed it. And the d'oyly carte company made a virtue of that. But of course, when that went out, that went out of business in the 80s, and it all went out of copyright. So it was suddenly possible to do them in lots of different ways. And, the most famous version of the Mikado now is Jonathan Miller's E&O version, which is set in a 1920s hotel as though it were a Jack Buchanan British musical.
Yeah.
But that's not the only example. You can still do it speech marks traditionally, but now people do it in lots and lots of different ways.
I wonder what it is about a piece that lends itself to that, if that makes sense. Because comparing Jesus Christ Superstar to all of Weber and Rice's other shows, it's the only one that it makes sense to take that approach with, if that makes sense.
That's interesting, isn't it? But, well, is that because it plays the game, and this is back to the plot, it plays the game of suggesting that this is the story of Jesus. And it is, of course, the story of Jesus at one level. But it's actually not. It's sort of about how society works when something is going wrong, how mass movements work. It's actually, and as you've said so rightly, that is why most directors then pin the mass movement of the moment onto it.
Yeah.
But you could just as easily set it in Tsarist Russia and make it about Lenin.
Absolutely, yeah. And it would make just as much sense.
It would still probably work, yeah.
And I feel like that's the reason it's lasted, is not because it's not really interested in the Christian faith and telling the Bible version of the story. As you say, it's
not dogmatic. No,
it's very much, it's the movement versus the man.
Yes,
the all powerful kind of government figure that's in this. But there's what I find fascinating, particularly for such an early show in both Weber and Rice's career, is how nuanced it goes into that. We see the infighting within the revolutionary movement about what that movement is supposed to be.
Yes.
And the way movements get tied to individuals, and the trappings of that. And then also, interestingly for me, the way Pilate is presented as one of the most sympathetic figures in the show.
Yes.
Strangely. And you almost see how, obviously Pilate, at the end of the day, he does come down on the side of crucifying Christ, but he's presented as somebody who does everything he can to not do that. And you almost see how public opinion and how the system of government changes the will of good people who try to go into that sphere to do good things, if that makes sense.
I know exactly what you mean by that, and I think that's a very shrewd observation. Well, I'm really glad you said that, because I think that then allows us to move on to my second observation, if that's okay, which is about the characterizations. And I agree with you. The character and performance of Pontius Pilate is by far the most sympathetic character, it seemed to me, including over Jesus and Judas, and we'll talk about that in a minute, in the entire piece. He was the character I felt most connection with, because this is going to sound terribly egotistical, but he's clearly the cleverest man in the room. Well, he sort of is, isn't he? There's a lot of the other people are very emotional. Understandable. But he not only is an intelligent man in his own right and a thoughtful man. The first time we see him, he comes on and he's not just dismissing his dreams. He's wondering if they are some kind of portent. And he's ponderous. And then they dress him up as a barrister, for goodness sake. I mean, that's, the symbolism of that is a man who's intelligent and can see the way things work and is able to negotiate how things work in order to presumably get what they want out of it. I mean, he's essentially the governor. Well, he was the governor. But he's also, he's a bit of a one-man government, I think, in some senses. He seems to be the dispenser of justice, as you would be as governor and things like that, so he's a bit of a judge too, hence the dressing up as the barrister stroke judge. And I think this is what marks him out from all the other characters. He sees how history is going, and I think he can see what will happen if Jesus is executed.
Yeah.
I think he can see the danger. He's fully aware of the hypocrisy and cant of the people calling for Jesus's execution. When they claim that they follow, Caesar is their one true king, And he turns on them and says, but you detest Caesar more than you detest Jesus.
Yeah.
And that is a man who gets the politics and who knows, he understands how the politics works, he understands how the people work, and let's never forget that politics is merely people. I mean, it's got a bad name these days, but politics is the interaction of people. And everything about him is the voice of reason in an unreasonable situation. Now, that may be a fairly controversial thing to say, because obviously one is presumably expected to like the Jesus character the most. So let me move on to that, because this is what I found very strange. I didn't like Jesus. And it wasn't the performer. I think it's the way it's written.
Interesting.
Now, we are set up on that interpretation of him, if people share that interpretation with me, by Judas, of course, who must be described as an unreliable witness, I suppose, in the historical testament. But he sets it up by saying, look, we used to have this movement, and let us never forget we're being oppressed, which takes us back together. You know, that reminds us what the movement is about. But Jesus is now starting to believe his own hype, is essentially the argument being made. You know, people have been claiming it's all very clever, this. You know, Jesus, when people say to Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? He always says, that's what you say.
Yes.
So we never hear him claim it himself, but we do see him act as though he sort of believes it. But his character isn't very, and I know there's a difference, but I've learnt this from Stephen Sondheim, nice is different from good. But he's not very nice.
No.
And this is why I re-stress again that I'm not talking about the theological aspects of this. I'm talking about how as written and performed.
Yeah.
Jesus, all the way through, he says the things that we know he is reported to have said from the Bible. You know, we see the anointing of the feet, and he was friends with Mary Magdalene, who, for the purpose, you know, the bone of contention here is that she is a prostitute, a sex worker. And Judas says, is she really the kind of person? She'll bring our reputation down. And then Jesus says, how dare you judge her? But Jesus, you know, so these are very laudable things, he says. And yet there's something about the tone and the character as written is that he does look like he's rather enjoying the hype surrounding him.
Yes.
He does rather bask in the appreciation. I mean, you know, there's even a moment when he surfs the crowd, even though he's complaining about it at the time. He's a bit, he's not very nice to Peter.
No.
You know, there's that scene, isn't it, where he comes in and says, hang on a minute, you lot, you don't really care about me.
Yeah.
Now, once again, I know this comes from the Bible, but actually the way it comes across when you actually see it performed is that this is, I'm going to have to say it, Jesus in this is written as a narcissist. So he's very good at talking about other people. And how they should act. But everything is through the prism of him. And it's cleverly written all the way through. Even, you know, everything he does, he's not very nice to Judas. Judas is a friend spurned by the look of it. I appreciate there's a question about the political differences going off in different directions. But, you know, Jesus doesn't say a nice thing about Judas at any stage. There's no moment of reconciliation with Judas, as far as I can see, in the piece. So, and you would have hoped that friends who hadn't fallen out, you would hope that friends who allegedly hadn't fallen out would have some kind of moment. And you sort of expect, from the traditional view of Jesus, that Jesus would be a bit more empathetic.
Yeah.
But we don't get any of that. He's very keen on Mary, but we don't really know if that's, I must say, whether that's because he's coming from a great height of humanity or whether she's the only woman of any significance in the piece.
Yeah.
But, you know, is he getting sexual favours from her? That is a distinct reading that's interpreted. Well, you can interpret it that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I think you have to within the context of what we're seeing. And then all the way, as I say, he goes away and comes back and then lambasts everyone about how they're all rotten and they don't care about him. But you don't hear him doing much caring about them. And then, of course, then he gets angry at God. And then finally, even down to when he's on the cross, all the things he says there, I am thirsty, why have you forsaken me? It's all very blamey. It's all very, I am the centre of attention here. Even down to, I commend my soul to heaven.
Yeah.
It's somebody commending themselves as a good person. It's not they are being commended by other people, which is what we're sort of culturally accepted is the way forward. You know, it's nice to have someone else nominate you for something. It's always sneered at slightly if you nominate yourself. And that is essentially what's going on here. So the Jesus character, I'm afraid, is, I think, incredibly unsympathetic, which is a clever bit of writing because it's not what you expect. But the problem, therefore, is it completely hollows out the centre of the narrative. Because if the biblical story of Jesus is about anything, it's about Jesus. I mean, the Gospels of the four, you know, let's be honest, this is what... the Gospels are all about Jesus from their different vantage points, but he is the central character. And if you hollow him out, what do you have left?
So picking up on that, because that's, for me, it's a really interesting take on it. The bit that I think is essential to Jesus' characterization in it is you're absolutely right. He is projecting himself as this kind of self-important figure, but I read that as internally he's having a crisis of faith. There's a really interesting decision, and again, has to emphasize, as you were saying, that this isn't about theology. This is very much the way this show is written. Very deliberately, there are no miracles in this show. Right up to the point that Jesus dies on the cross and he isn't resurrected in the text.
No.
Some productions choose to use the final instrumental to show some form of resurrection. Some don't. And that's a really interesting point of contention in the piece. So the question then becomes, in the world of this story, is God real?
Oh, now that's interesting. I'd like to offer a slight recalibration of that.
Okay.
I think in this story that God is as real as he is in any other world. I'm hedging my bets there. But I question whether Jesus is the Son of God. So that was the nugget I was hanging it on.
Right.
I don't think it necessarily questions God. Oddly, I don't think God needs to be in the piece at all. I think the question is Jesus the Son of God? He never says so.
Mm.
It's always alleged of him. Well, It's not actually, is it? The King of the Jews, which is the implicit term for Son of God, I suppose, or is that 200 years of cultural connection? And have I conflated those two things together because that's what we've all been encouraged to do in the 20th and 21st century? Mm. But I personally didn't take it about a question about whether God's in the picture. I don't think he's there at all, or which is not to say I'm taking an atheist position on it. I'm saying that I don't think the God element of this story is at all relevant.
That's interesting.
Which I think is the same thing you're saying. But I do think that the question about Jesus' relationship with God is the crux of it. That's odd, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I've just said he's not there, but it's about...
So that's...
But you could still have a relationship with someone, with something that isn't there. People can have a relationship with an invisible friend. I'm not making any theological point there. I'm just trying to think of other psychological circumstances where that is a legitimate and genuine thing.
It's the reason I come to that sort of thing of... I feel like there is a discussion of whether or not... Because what it comes down to is whether the faith that Christ is teaching in the show... whether in the world of the show it actually is valid. Because towards the end of the show, Jesus, I think throughout the whole piece, Jesus knows that he's reaching the end of his life. He can see, and that's not a kind of, he's had a premonition or anything. He can just see the way the political movement is going.
Yeah.
And Gethsemane is a moment where when he's singing those lines, I want to know my God, he wants to be proven that at least he was doing the right thing if he is going to give his life for this. And so that, to me, is where a lot of his narcissism comes from. It's the fact that internally he's having this huge crisis of faith. And he needs to project some confidence somewhere to feel validated in that, if that makes sense.
But that just makes him a believer of God rather than a believer that he's the Son of God, doesn't it?
In a way, yeah. I guess so.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's answers to this, by the way. I'm just
yeah.
probing a little bit further. So, yes, you're right. That makes absolute sense because you can see him. I mean, he's in distress.
Yeah.
And that is true. I think so. I think you're right. There is a sense that he knows the curtain is coming down soon. I mean, he says it several times overtly as well. So,
yeah.
And is it worth it? Yes.
And that's where a lot of his posturing, in a way, I guess, comes from. And I think that's a really interesting narrative choice because I'd say Judas is probably presented to begin with much more sympathetically than Jesus is.
Yes.
And it's like the show withholds Jesus's conflict and why he's being like this until we're into the second act and we get to Gethsemane when everyone's asleep and he has that... It's almost like a showdown with the heavens. That massive power ballad. Which is, for me, is one of the greatest songs that those two have ever written.
Do you know that's interesting? Because I discussed it briefly with Tim Saywood, and he said that he's not religious, and he won't be saying that, but he gets a huge thrill from that song. He finds there's something, and he thinks it's in the structure of the song. I don't want to quote him too much because that's not my place, and we didn't go into it in that depth. But that song really means something to him. I found that song quite terrifying. No, that's not true. What's the word I found? I found that song unpleasant, actually.
Interesting. Why?
And the reason I found it unpleasant is because it was piling on the narcissism of the character. So it was driving me further and further away from Jesus' character rather than drawing me to him. Because he does spend... I'm sorry, I'm going to have to use the word bleating. And once again, I don't want to offend anyone, and it's not the theological thing we're arguing here. We're talking about the performance and the way it's been written into this. But, he talks about, I tried for 3 years, but it seemed like 30. 3 years isn't very long. There's quite a lot of, I've done my best. I've done this for 3 years, and now I'm through. And you think, but that seems so kind of, I've done a bit and it didn't work, so I'm giving it up. It seemed almost childish.
But so for me, that argument is that he's saying he's given a chunk of his life to this faith and pushing this, and he's just asking for something in return to prove that it was a valid way to spend that time, if that makes sense. So I understand what you mean, that like in the context he hasn't spent long on it, but I guess in the comparison of between him and the God he believes in, who we're led to believe in this, has not presented himself in any way, unlike comparing this to obviously the Bible story. Jesus has seen God and God has acted through him, various miracles, that kind of thing. I think in the world of this story, that hasn't happened, and that's deliberately shown throughout by a complete lack of miracles.
Yeah, there is a bit of faith healing, though, isn't there, going on? But we don't necessarily see the people get better.
Exactly.
And we also know from genuine experience that actually an awful lot of people who claim to have been made better by faith healers are acting psychosomatic.
Exactly. Yeah.
So so that is deeply ambiguous. So I accept that point absolutely that you're making there. That's really interesting.
So the centre of the song, when it goes to the I have to know my God" lines, the desperation of that is where I feel like the crux of Jesus' character is that moment of doubt in the final moments of his life.
But does anyone have the right to demand that God makes an appearance for them? And don't forget, Jesus is a man. I mean, and that's the whole question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is Jesus a man, or is Jesus the Son of God? Is the question still being asked in this musical?
It's a great question. I don't know. I guess that's what that's.
I need a great answer, Tom. And you got 10 seconds.
Big talk, but yeah, no, it's that exactly. It's those kind of questions that are at the centre of the show for me. It's interesting. Just a very quick point of comparison. A lot of approaches to Gethsemane are quite certainly in those opening lines. It's a very sad kind of performance of it. Quite a sort of upset approach to it. There was a really interesting novel take on the Regent's Park production that I really hope, by the way, they were filming and screening for an audience outside. Like there was a live feed so more people could see it, because obviously they had to socially distance in the stalls. So I do wonder, they clearly have video of it. I don't know if they ever plan on releasing it, but I really hope they do, because it was a spectacular production.
Well, the open-air stuff does occasionally surface, doesn't it? Because their magnificent Into the Woods from a few years ago is widely available, including on Broadway HD. So,
fingers crossed. But there was an actor muso element of this production, and when it hits Gethsemane, unlike most versions, which is, it starts with him on the floor and he's begging, this started, Jesus stood there, acoustic guitar, he was playing the opening chords, really sort of strumming them like loudly, and it was a defiant moment, and almost flipped as this kind of moment of strength compared to what the character is for a lot of the show, who is a character that's very angsty, very internal, and lashes out. And it was just a really fresh and interesting performance and take on it that I really admired.
And that would make sense, because it does set him up for the final interrogation and execution, actually, if he's been given that kind of, if you like, internal resolve, because he... So what, I mean, I'm interpreting what you're saying here, but it sounds like you're actually sort of saying he finds his God figuratively in that performance of that song, which isn't always the case in the others. Yeah,
it's definitely a moment of resolve for him, whether that resolve is in he finds his faith, or whether it's in he's come to terms with the fact that he will not get that.
Yes. Oh, crikey.
Either way, if that makes sense. I'm not sure which it is.
So as you say, he finds resolve, but one way or the other.
Yeah, and this is why I love this show. Like so much of the show, what that resolve is so ambiguous, and leaves so much to discussion.
Well, as we've proven today, the ambiguity is very much the issue, but also the answer. Strangely, isn't it? Musical talk. Well, that was the very excellent Tom Arnold, and as always, everything he had to say was really interesting, or at least it was to me. I find it particularly good that we came at it from two very different angles. He had seen so many different productions and had that breadth of knowledge, understanding and observation, whereas I had only recently seen it in one version for the very first time. And I think that afforded us a good opportunity to look at it from two different angles. And the conversation, as you've heard, isn't over yet, because part 2 of it will be broadcast in the next episode of Musical Talk. And if that's not an invitation or a lure to bring you back for another edition, I don't know what is. Or isn't. So, they always say leave them wanting more, or in my case, less, but certainly wanting more of Tom Arnold. So let's do that by finishing this episode to give you an entire week to drool at the mouth at the prospect of further conversation with him, and then please do join us again in a week's time. And to make that event happen, i.e. the ending of this episode, in order to usher in the next, let me say the magic word. Alakazam! Oh, that hasn't worked. There must be a different magic word. Let's try this one. Goodbye. Yeah, that's it. This episode of Musical Talk presented by Thos Ribbits and Tom Arnold, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2022. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos.
That's going now.
And so's mine. So are you happy to... Shall we say this together?
Absolutely, all together now.
3, 2, 1, start. There we are. Well, that's as near as damn it.
It's close.
But at least I know where the recording starts there for when I marry the two together. So thank you.
100%.
And that seems to be going. And so as far as I'm concerned, we've got the master recording just in case everything goes terribly wrong. And we've got your feed and my feed. That's that.
Great.
And frankly, if they all go wrong, we'll just have to do it again. I'm not saying this is the interpretation, but it is personally... I can't say it at all, it seems.